Hi, everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and joining me on today's show is someone who truly needs no introduction to anyone with a passing interest in the UFO topic or the history of the UFO phenomenon. Richard Dolan is one of the most respected and well-known researchers, authors, and speakers in this field. He's the author of the landmark two-volume series UFOs and the National Security State, as well as the infamous AD After Disclosure and UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, along with Bryce Zabel, of course. Works that have become essential reading for anyone trying to understand how governments, militaries, and intelligence agencies have engaged with the UFO mystery over decades. His approach has always been grounded in rigorous historical fact and research, clear-eyed analysis, and cuts through a lot of noise and speculation to focus on what the evidence actually shows. Beyond his books, he's familiar face from countless documentaries, interviews, his own platform, Richard Dolan Members, where all the links are in the description, where he continues to explore both the UFO subject and he also goes a little bit off-piste as well. I'm going to welcome now to the show Richard Dolan. Richard, welcome back.
Hi, Andy. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Very good to have you on, Richard, and genuinely could have you on a weekly basis for those conversations. But I want to kick off actually with your latest venture. In the last couple of months, you joined Need to Know with Bryce Zabel. I just had Bryce on the podcast last month, and he was obviously waxing lyrical, as we say, about you joining. It's a wonderful, I wouldn't say replacement for Ross Coulthart, because it's not a like-for-like substitution, but I love the change of direction, and I think if you're going to change what it was, there's not been many folks better than yourself, Richard, that could have been brought in. How's it been for you joining Bryce with Need to Know and that whole transition?
It's really enjoyable. Bryce and I, of course, have a relationship going back more than 15 years. We wrote a book together. So that's something, at least for me, that's a special professional relationship, and I've done that with no other person. I've never co-authored a book with anybody else. So Bryce will always be kind of close to me on that basis. We've shared a lot. The book we wrote, of course, was AD After Disclosure. Still, to this day, the only full-length book that I'm aware of that actually tries to analyze the whole process of UFO disclosure and how it might happen and how it might affect our world. Anyway, I used to follow Ross Coulthart with Bryce on Need to Know. I thought it was always a very interesting show. And I was surprised that Ross decided to leave. But looking back, not totally surprised. Ross has a lot going on with News Nation. And there's only so many hours in a day. So Bryce asked me if I would consider basically replacing Ross's role there. And we both agreed, like I said, I would be happy to do it, but I can't do a show like that the way Ross did it, which is, Ross is an excellent journalist, and he is on top of many, if not all, of the latest developments in the UFO community. I'm on top of those developments too, but that's really not my main thing. I'm a historian. I look at the long view of things. I try to look at the philosophy of UFOs, as it were, and I just try to ask those types of questions. So for me, when I'm engaging in a conversation, I don't want to put this in a disparaging way, because it isn't meant that way, but I would not be well served if I were to be chasing headlines in this field all the time. There are people who are excellent at that, and they need to do that, the current news, but that's just not what I've ever wanted to do. I try to look at a different angle of all of this. So when I did this with Bryce, and as we've continuing to do it, we just decided, like, my approach was going to be a little bit more big picture oriented, a little more philosophical, and we'll just see how that works. I think Bryce is very, very happy with that too. We have great conversations. I think we have a nice chemistry and rapport, and it works really well. I thought it worked very well with Ross. So, but it's true. Like we just look at this in slightly different. We have very similar perspectives, actually, but we approach it maybe a little differently. So I think that worked just fine. I'm glad I'm doing this with Bryce.
Yeah, it's been working out well. And has that relationship, obviously it's been, like you say, 15 years, you've co-authored with After Disclosure AD, has that brought on any interest in further projects together outside of Need to Know? I think a lot of folks look at, is there a time to write a second volume of AD after Disclosure? Things are different from when you wrote that first time round.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, honestly, that's a book. I look back on that as that was written 15 years ago in a totally different time. The world was very different, and it really could benefit from a substantial rewrite, whether by Bryce and me or by someone else who wants to write a book about disclosure. A lot of people can do this. I've thought about it many times. It's not impossible that we will go at it again. The big limitation is probably, I'm going to guess, me. I'm in the midst of a 3-volume series on USOs. We can chat about that. I'm just finishing. I'm publishing, in fact, the 2nd volume as we speak, and that should be out soon. The writing's all done. So I've got that, and I just have so many other writing projects that I have on my mind. I keep asking myself, would we ever do a revision of After Disclosure? It would be a good project to do, and I think it could be worthwhile, and it's not impossible. But he and I, we have not talked about that in a little while. We did discuss it. I have a feeling if we got into that conversation, we might just get enough motivation to go on and do a revised version. You never know.
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of appetite for that, and from what people say to me and listeners and viewers, there's definitely that out there. And what we're going to do for this interview, if we want to call it that, Richard, because I've had you on the podcast now a few times. Very fortunately, I appreciate your time. I want to discuss some of what's happening right now. And you mentioned you're a historian. You're great at looking back, the bigger picture, the philosophy, like you mentioned, of this topic is so varied. But there's a lot to talk about right now. So what I'm going to do is split it into 2 halves, where the listeners will get the second half, where I've got a whole plethora of questions for you. But I want to dig into your thoughts right now, because like you say, in 15 years since that last book happened, so much has changed. And I wonder, this is something that gets brought up often to me. I'm 39 years old, so I'm still relatively young in terms of the UFO topic and what I've seen and what I've heard brought up on the internet, social media. You have a longer view of the UFO topic than me. Have we been here before in terms of where the UFO topic is, the state of play, the way people think about it? And if so, when? And if not, how is it different?
Yeah, in some ways, yes, and in other ways, absolutely not. There are certain commonalities between this era and certain times of the past. Just for very quick reference, so back even in the late 1940s and in the early 1950s, particularly, there was a kind of crescendo with the flying saucers, as they were called at that time. Lots of sightings, lots of buzz about it in the United States and to a more limited extent elsewhere. But throughout the Western world, there was questions about this. In the U.S., there was the kind of crescendo that happened in the summer of 1952, and people wondered what's happening. It's got a lot of press coverage. And then it just got kind of shut down within the classified world in what we call the Robertson panel. Nothing really happened. It wasn't until the 1960s that the crescendo happened again. This time it was much more public, much more powerful. That was discussed in Congress for the first time in the mid-1960s. There was a talk that the University of Colorado, which was hired to do a scientific study of UFOs in the late 60s, like all of that was bringing this subject out in the public realm as something that to be talked about. The Colorado study basically shut it down in 1968, 69, said there's nothing to this. So again, you had the crescendo and then you had the crash. But then in the 1970s, we had freedom of information laws passed in the U.S. that gave renewed hope that if we just declassified the right document, that could break open the secrecy. And there were a lot of documents that were revealed during that time that did show a UFO reality and a cover-up. But that did not lead to a disclosure either. Through the late 80s, there were more rumors and leaks, whether true or not true, of different types of secret government activities relating to UFOs. By the early 2000s, there was a whole new disclosure effort led by, and I forgot, the whole Roswell event really just became very much publicized during the late 80s and 1990s, but that did not lead to anything. And then you have the disclosure movement of the 21st century. People like Dr. Stephen Greer, Steve Bassett, and others were leading that charge. And there were a series of conferences. It's like we've been through this before. There have always been these moments where people have thought, if we just present the strongest argument, put it before the public, and get our political leaders to talk about it, we might be able to have a breakthrough. And there have been all of these attempts. Some of them just failed outright. Others failed partially, had little partial successes here and there, but we've not gotten to a point of disclosure. So now, since 2017, we've had a completely new public conversation on this subject. It's unlike anything that's happened in the past. Why? It's a really good question. This is something that we even talked about in After Disclosure, particularly my line of thought back in earlier decades was, we as a society are more and more getting to a point where it could become unavoidable to talk about this, if for no other reason than because of the web and connectivity that we have globally, which is enabling a kind of conversation about the subject to develop and to continue to grow in a way that it could not have done prior to the age of social media and the web itself. So I think that's a different factor. And I actually think that's the foundation of how even the New York Times reported on this in 2017. There was enough of I would say, I'm going to call it a dissident movement among certain people close to the seat of power who were not satisfied with UFO secrecy. This, by the way, has always been the case. It's always been the case. There have always been people in the kind of establishment faction that were not happy with the policy of UFO secrecy. And these individuals, I think, were able to get the New York Times to agree to two stories on this in 2017. And it's opened things up, and it has not fully closed. And now, because this is an age of social media, because this is an age of total connectivity, I think it has encouraged a number of people, we'll call them the whistleblowers now, to start coming forward, to start telling their stories. And I think the real tipping point was when Ross Coulthard interviewed David Grush a couple of years ago. Maybe that would be the tipping point. Grush was such a compelling individual, talking about, first of all, from his position, which was connected with NSA, connected with the UAP task force, connected with, very classified positions, and connected with classified oversight through Congress. Grush is someone you just could not dismiss, and he's talking about, yes, we have technology and the biologics, the bodies. So I think that was the turning point in 2023. But it was really just the result of this latest wave of this latest push, which I think was aided and abetted by the digital era we live in. And I don't think it's going away as easily as the other ones. I had a conversation recently with retired Army Colonel Carl Nell about this. Carl believes that we may be at the end of this disclosure cycle. It's a very interesting thought, and he may be right, but it's not clear to me that we're at the end of a cycle. It is true the UAP Disclosure Act has fundamentally failed, we could say, to be passed in its full form for 3 years in a row now. And that's not hopeful in that sense, but I don't think we're at the end. I think the difference now is that the disclosure movement has got a far greater groundswell of support than it's ever had. That is not a trivial thing. And even if it keeps getting shut down in Congress, I don't think we're seeing the end of new leaks, new whistleblowers, and new possibilities to challenge the status quo. I don't think that's going to end. The real question is, can those leaks be strong enough to actually create a major crack in the system that it results in some genuine openness? Grush's revelations didn't do it, and you would think they would. In fact, let me just close with saying this. When Bryce and I wrote AD After Disclosure in 2010, I think we would have thought, and I think most people would have thought, like if they had been able to hear David Grush's interview all those years in advance, back in 2010 or 2009, I think most people would have thought, good God, this has got to end the secrecy. This is a revelation that is too big to ignore. And yet it didn't happen. Like, that did not happen. That is something that really must be studied carefully so that we can understand, why did it not happen? Because I strongly believe if that interview had happened 15 years earlier, maybe we would have been wrong then too, but I think most of us would have thought that will cause disclosure, and it didn't. It did not. So, but nevertheless, the game isn't over either. There will be, I believe there will be more people like David Grush to come forward. In fact, some have already. Matthew Brown is another person who's, I think, a very powerful whistleblower, and there have been others. And I don't think that that story is over. So Yogi Berra, I think, said, it ain't over till it's over. And I think that's what I think too. I think this is a process. How it's going to end, when this will take the next step into a kind of a new, more deeper reality of this, I don't know. But I don't think it's over.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the end of the disclosure cycle conversation with Carl Nell. It was really interesting. I liked your comeback on it. I got to follow that up with Carl Nell at the Soul Symposium, and he said similar to, I think, what you came back with, that just because this cycle ends doesn't mean the next cycle isn't far away, and what that cycle looks like might be different. I think you're completely right that if David Grush had come forward, perhaps even in the late 90s to early 2000s, that's a much bigger or longer lasting impact, because I think there was an impact, but it was very quick and sudden. And then it went away. There have been other whistleblowers. From what I understand, whistleblowers right now are working together in the background. They're not just floating around doing nothing. And I'm sure that's stuff people will hear about in the near future. I don't know much more than that. I'm not giving anything away, but from what I'm told, there's stuff afoot. People love to hear the coming soon, don't they? But yeah, it's the facts in this case. And I wonder, what will it take then if Grush 15 years ago was something that really could have broken down the door of secrecy? What will it take now? And I'll segue into the Age of Disclosure documentary, comes out on the 21st of November. I really hope that it can move the needle. I don't think it will with the public for multiple reasons. I think, given it came out back in March or April at South by Southwest, and the people who saw it, including listeners to this podcast, and I spoke to some of them afterwards, they were very complimentary about the credibility and the weight of the individuals speaking on camera about what they know, what they think, why this is important, why we have to push forward. But I think it's going to be too dry for a general public to hold their attention for 90 minutes, let alone 2 hours, without any incredible footage or huge revelations. And I think people are so desensitized in 2025 to a lot of things, not just the UFO topic, that I'll put it back to you. What are your thoughts on Age of Disclosure coming out when it is, and what's it going to take to really move the ball forward?
Yeah, I think I agree with probably everything you just said there. I haven't seen it all. I've seen some clips. It looks really good. I'm sure it's excellent. Yeah, that's not going to be the problem. I think the problem, you touched on it. A, the public's become a bit desensitized. B, it's one thing for a documentary like that to have a number of fairly prominent public figures, at least members of Congress and maybe more, to talk about the UFO or UAP subject as reality. So that's all important. But will there be a smoking gun? I mean, we know that Lukatsky is in there talking about having been in contact with a craft, having touched a craft. I think that's a big part of it. And that's going to be interesting. But will that be enough to move the needle, as you ask? And I think it may not. I mean, it's not impossible, I suppose, but I would be surprised. It's really weird. Our whole society is just radically different in so many ways than it was a full generation ago. And one of those things, and this really is not going to sound complimentary, but I really wonder about our social, societal attention span and our ability actually to hang on to an extended argument. You were kind of hinting at this yourself with something that might be a little bit dry. It's 90 minutes. It requires you to concentrate and focus, maybe not stare at your phone while you're watching the show, like all of these things. And you really wonder, are people even going to be paying attention to this? And will they even care enough to pull themselves away from their latest Instagram feed to watch it? You know, you really have to wonder. It's a different world now. So I don't think it will. I mean, there have been a lot of excellent documentaries that have come out over the last several years, several of them by James Fox. Truly excellent. And it's, I think, a matter of getting them the kind of public conversation they need, and they just don't get. You know, it's a weird thing. All of us who are part of what we can call the alternative media, which is you and me and probably everyone listening, most people, there's this tendency to dismiss the establishment legacy media as irrelevant. But I don't think it's irrelevant. I think it's actually still relevant, still very powerful and influential, despite the fact that many people don't watch it anymore. But it is still, it's like our version of what Pravda was for the old Soviet Union. It is still the organ of official truth. And until, I hate to say this, but until the establishment media truly gets on board with these subjects, and they still haven't. They still really haven't. I have a feeling we're not really going to have a national conversation that moves us forward. It's a weird thing to say, because, well, I want to say, just like anyone else, that the establishment media is completely irrelevant, but I don't think it's irrelevant. It's still quite powerful. And they're just not giving the subject the time of day it deserves. They're really not. I mean, we had the 2 New York Times articles in 2017, a couple of follow-ups in the Times, which were permitted. Nothing since 2020. That's been serious. And where's the establishment television media on this? Basically absent. They're not really covering this in any way beyond kindergarten level. So there's still a lot of resistance. And, you know, I was thinking about my Grush statement earlier. So what Grush said in 2023 was very powerful. And yes, had he been covered like this by a national media in 2010 or earlier, it would have made a big thing. But of course, he would not have been, because there were people saying things similar to David Grush for many years, but they were saying them quietly to private researchers who could not get the time of day from the establishment media back then. So the whole thing is just, it has clogged up. The establishment media has basically caused a roadblock or clogged up the public discussion of this. So it's all over YouTube, it's all over Twitter X, it's all over other forms of media. But it's a crazy thing to say, but it's not being discussed by the major networks in any nation. And I think as a result, it's really not getting the attention it deserves politically.
I spoke to a documentary team at the Sol Symposium, and they're from the UK, a pretty prominent channel. And I've been speaking to them since this summer. They were looking to get in touch with various different people and asked if I could help out with that. And then in speaking to them in person at the Sol, I got to ask them about how they were planning and pitching this documentary on a pretty serious channel. And I was looking, you're not going to go with the X-Files music and the little green men, CGI and the flying saucers. And they were like, well, we're going to kick off with that probably, but what we want to do is then take the audience on a journey. And I was like, if you really feel you have to, but I think this is part of the issue, that if you ask 99% of the general public, take 2 minutes and write down for me, what does your average UFO documentary look like? I think they would all draw something pretty similar in terms of a plan. You know, X-Files music, you know, Little Green Men, see some clips, some of them good, some of them not so good, some talking heads, some people who come across partially crazy, and then it ends with, who knows, you know, is there something out there? And I was like, I think there's an appetite for something a little bit different. And like you say, there are some very good documentaries, especially from James Fox, out there already. James has his documentary Moment of Contact, New Revelations, extended edition coming out in the coming weeks. obviously has just done an interview with Ross Coulthart where he has a doctor that he has spoken to now on camera who has said, and this was all in the News Nation clip, that he was face to face with this alien being with a teardrop head, teardrop eyes, unequivocally an alien entity for up to 4 minutes. And that's out there. And if that's not grabbing public attention, what is going to?
Exactly.
People will watch it and go, "Oh wow, isn't that cool?" Like, and then swipe to the next video, and that's a big issue for me.
Yeah, you mentioned British media, and I know you're over in the UK there, but I just have to say, British media has been some of the worst anywhere in covering this subject.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond bad, cringe bad. But you know, all British media is in bed with British intelligence, and it serves an agenda. I don't think there's any debate about that or any controversy. So that is what they do, and that's what they've always done. They're worse than the U.S. media, which is bad. U.S. media is terrible on this, but I have to say it's even worse in the United Kingdom. But yeah, the thing is, until this subject, it's a weird thing. We say we don't need establishment media, but I've come to believe that many people, maybe most people, instinctively still. People can disagree here in the comments below. I would like to hear some other opinions. I'm going to read. I think that most people still take their cue from what they will perceive as authority. And when it's on television news, that has the ring of government authority. It really does when you really think about it.
Yep.
Certainly BBC, but certainly the US majors, the same thing. And so it's like when you hear something in the establishment media, it's basically, this is what the government considers to be important. It's a weird thing. America's media was never supposed to be that way, but it clearly is. But I think people still look to that for cues. And until they get it, I don't really know how it's going to change. The UAP disclosure transparency movement. This is something I said to Carl in our discussion on this. I think they have to make inroads into the establishment media, which is like as hard as making inroads into the CIA. It's not easy, but I think it's actually got to be a strategy moving forward on this.
I've not spoken to you since the hearings happened a couple of months ago now. And for me, in the last couple of years, you've had those initial hearings, the Bray and Moultrie hearing with Gillibrand, and we then segued into the Grush hearing with Fravor and Graves, which probably was the pinnacle for me of anything we've had in terms of hearings. And I feel the most recent hearing was better than the previous one with Elizondo, Schellenberger, Gold, etc. But the big issue for me, and I'd love your take on the video that was shown compared to the testimony, because I was actually quite impressed with the testimony from Wiggins, Knapp, Nusatelli and Borland. And I feel that video really took away from it. And there's still a lot of debate online. I don't feel that video showed anything anomalous at all, other than a military test of a missile with no warhead going through likely a target balloon or drone. And it just shows for me how easy you can distract even the UFO UAP community by giving them something. And it's like pigeons, they'll fight amongst themselves. And I'm including myself in that, because so many folks had so many different opinions, and it took away from the testimony. And all I saw, especially in US media, was people showing that video and talking about that video, and the testimony just completely fell by the wayside. And do you think that's a deliberate tactic that's used?
Yes, yeah, I do. I think that's always been a tactic that establishment media has always used to kneecap or disable the stories that they don't want to have credibility. You find the weakest link, then you just hammer away at that. So that's an old game. And yeah, I think the video was a weak link. I agree with you. I'm trying to remember the specifics. It was presented as something that I think was studied or determined to be a UAP. Am I wrong? I think
Yeah.
that's what
No,
they
you're
said.
right.
So it would be. It's almost similar to how when Fravor came out with and talked about the Tic Tac encounter. You know, all kinds of people and skeptics saying the same thing about those videos that were released. That didn't say anything. It was ridiculous. But the thing that made that strong then and now to me is you had Fravor's testimony itself, which I think is you can't really dismiss. And same thing with the testimony at the hearings. I think, the fact that that video came out as in the context as a UAP encounter, that doesn't prove it's a UAP, I admit, but I guess I'm not familiar with any debunking takedowns of that video as prosaic, and maybe that's just my fault that I haven't kind of gotten on top of that. But I mean, we're always aware there's always pros and cons on these videos anytime they come out. The most important thing in that hearing, well, there are quite a few, but I will just say the one that I think is the most low-hanging fruit that we must follow up on is, once again, we hear about this contact between Lockheed Martin, the CIA, and Robert Bigelow's Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Systems Company, which we heard yet again about the failed transfer of UAP craft technology from Lockheed Martin to Bigelow. That was stopped twice by a CIA officer by the name of Glenn Gaffney. Now, to me, we've been hearing about this story for several years. I think it's got some legs. We don't have proof, but there are people that could be subpoenaed to offer testimony. Robert Bigelow, for instance, Glenn Gaffney, for instance, Luis Elizondo, for instance. Luis Elizondo was involved. He was there on the scene during this. He was with Robert Bigelow's company. And even Mike Gold, who was at the previous hearing that you mentioned, he had a connection to this at the time. All of these, and I have no doubt if they were interviewed, they would be able to come up with yet more names who had connections. To me, that is an incredibly potentially powerful story that is just sitting there right in front of us, begging for a hearing. And then there were other stories and things that came out during that last hearing of a couple of months ago, which I agree were very compelling and very powerful. And yes, got no attention while everyone was running in circles around the video. Was it a Hellfire missile? What the hell was it? And what was this object? And back and forth. It's almost as if all people can really discuss are pictures and not words. They can't discuss text anymore.
Again, I think that speaks to the point we're making around people's attention span, that you can watch that video over and over and over again in the space of 20 seconds and swipe off when you're ready to move on to something else. And it's much easier than focusing in on George Knapp's multiple name drops and the cases he talked about, or Dylan Borland's case, and going back to it and really paying attention to what's being said, how it's said, the tone of voice, the inflections in a voice. I don't think the general public have that interest.
Borland, I don't want to, I'm sorry for interrupting you. Let me just say this one thing. I think Borland was the big surprise of that hearing for me and probably for a lot of people. And I just want to say again, he came across, I think, in a very powerful, very credible way. And I thought the account of his sighting was quite compelling, and the story of how he argues he was persecuted as a result of what he knew and has said, I think, is also compelling. And his emotions came out, and I think that affected a lot of people.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, obviously, George Knapp brought up Glenn Gaffney. That's a name that's been mentioned multiple times in this topic in relation to it. Dick Cheney has just passed away in the last couple of days as we record this. He is, again, someone else who has been named as a real gatekeeper in terms of the UFO subject. Do you feel with the passing of some of the old guard, like a Mr. Dick Cheney, that frees up any room for progress in terms of real disclosure? Or is it like, the old Hydra, you cut one snake's head off and two spring up?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Many years ago, I had a conversation with one individual. I shouldn't mention his name, but he's known. And in the late 90s, he had very good access to a lot of individuals who were prominent within the military, the intelligence, and in the UFO field. Anyway, I remember him saying to me that he he actually had an insight into how the kind of international aspect of the cover-up was working. And what he discovered, this is just his own take, was that the older generation were more in favor of liberalizing things and moving toward a disclosure, and the younger generations were less in favor of that. And his understanding was that because they had not made all the money that they wanted to make on this, the older people were a little more reflective and thought, we'll let go on this. So I don't really think it's necessarily a case that the young generation is always the ones who are idealistic. And I mean, it can be that way, but I'm not sure it has to be that way. And even, I don't even know how accurate this person's information to me was at the time, but I was willing to accept that he might have had a good perspective on it. With Cheney, I mean, Cheney, of course, is a classic manager of the U.S. empire. He was one of the key operational managers of the U.S. Western Empire when he was in power and influence during the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000. He goes back to the mid 70s. He was friends with Donald Rumsfeld back in 1975. They both were powerful back then. So Cheney has a long history in managing the empire. So someone like that would absolutely not be in favor of any kind of disclosure. In fact, Grant Cameron, excellent longtime researcher about all of this, looked at U.S. presidential policy, talked about a time he was able to call in on a talk radio show in the early Bush years when Dick Cheney was vice president, and actually got Cheney to talk about UFO disclosure. And Cheney just said, I wish I could remember this exactly, but it was to the effect of, well, that's not something we discussed, but if it were, I wouldn't be able to talk about it. But there's a lot of talk about Cheney even earlier when he was at the Bush White House, the Bush senior White House, as Secretary of Defense, stopping dead in its tracks, being dead set against any kind of UFO disclosure. The story goes that as the Soviet Union was in the process of dissolving in the very early 90s, there were discussions within the U.S. White House at that time as to whether or not a UFO disclosure was warranted. You know, it's the end of the Cold War. Maybe the reasons for this secrecy can go away. And as the account goes, Cheney was dead set against that. He was probably the leader of the anti-disclosure movement. If it's true, I think it certainly could be true. I mean, it strikes me as plausible. We don't have proof. So will there be change? There's always change. Our society is always in the process of change. It's the UFO disclosure situation is the closest thing that I can think of to describing the statement of the irresistible force versus the immovable object. You know, secrecy is that immovable object. There is just no logic by which those who are in true possession of this secret could want to reveal it. There's too much power, and there's too much, from their point of view, risk of instability. But it is an irresistible force nonetheless, because it is just not going away. There's truth in here, a lot of truth to the UFO reality. And it's just becoming impossible to ignore. So how this is going to play out is really the question. You've got the old guard that is still clearly not interested in giving any kind of opportunity for this to move forward. I think what you're looking at, especially within the U.S., is a real power struggle on this matter. There are forces. You had people in Congress in the last hearing referring to this indirectly, like mysterious forces that are blocking progress on this. Who are these mysterious forces? I don't even know if the members of Congress truly know. But there is power and influence behind the members of Congress, behind the White House, in any era, and behind the military-industrial complex in any era. And I think they just do not want this to go forward. So how... You're looking at an empire, the U.S. Western Empire, that, especially for the last 3 years, is showing real fractures that were not necessarily openly visible prior to, say, 2022. I'm speaking of the Russo-Ukrainian war, which has shown a lot of fissures in the Western alliance, serious structural problems. And so you're looking at an empire that is showing signs of serious weakness and cracking in various ways. And I think that can create a sense of desperation and a hardening of positions among those in power. And don't think it doesn't affect the UFO system and problem. I think it does. So I think you're going to see a greater intransigence versus a greater insistence. And how that's going to end up is really something that we're all going to have to see in real time.
I think I was speaking to someone recently, and I can't remember if it was on the podcast or someone else, and we were talking about the idea the toothpaste can't go back into the tube, and the truth is out there now in some way, shape, or form. And I agree, the toothpaste can't go back in the tube. But what I'm reminded of is, I don't know if you watched the Batman movies in the 90s, but Batman Forever with Two-Face at the end of the film, and I think it's long enough that I can. It was with Tommy Lee Jones, and Two-Face flips his coin up to decide whether he's going to do what he's going to do at the end of the film. I won't spoil too much, but Batman just takes out a pouch of coins and throws them all up in the air at the same time, and Two-Face can't find his coin and scrambles for it. And I feel that's all that's happening in terms of the truth being covered up, that you can get things out there, but then the way to mask that is just put so much BS out there that you have to wade through and find, where's the real coin in this? Where's the truth? You don't have to put
That's
that.
an excellent.
Yeah, you
That's
don't
a
have to
great
put that away.
analogy. Yeah, it's a great analogy, because that's kind of what we are seeing. Years and years ago, I remember talking when I was a brand new person in the UFO community 25 years ago. I had the good fortune to chat about the cover up with astronaut Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14. Who I was able to chat with him about this once in a while, and he said the thing is that this is a problem that is kind of hidden in plain sight. It's already out there. He said all the information that people should need is more than available, but it is extremely easy, he pointed out to me at that time, to do exactly as you just described, Andy, for lies and disinformation and misdirection to go out there and just to confuse the matter. And it's almost the situation where the government doesn't need to do censorship, because they're able to change the conversation, to confuse and muddy the waters. And I think that absolutely is a situation. It's like we have now too much information to process. We don't know how to process it all. And that's just as difficult as not having enough.
What for you right now is the biggest misdirection or misstep or misinformation that's out there, do you think?
It's a good question. Well, I don't know if I'm giving a good answer here. I think in general we have all right, so there's the UFO culture, and then there's the broader culture. So the broader culture is one in which, like, you have to ask yourself seriously, any observing intelligent aliens that are looking at our global culture have got to be wondering how stupid can these humans get? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Even entertainment that we consider to be serious level entertainment, I mean, there's so much of it is just propaganda and just nonsense. And then there's just so much terrible stuff. There's a new show on the Kardashians. There's another show on is it the Mormon Housewives? Like, it just gets stupider and stupider, and you just, there's no, like, I really do think it just lowers our discourse so badly. So there's that. But then even within the UFO community, even on YouTube, we're constantly chasing after the next new big thing. And you've got and this does not include you, and it doesn't include a lot of people, but there are others who you just sense they're so sensationalistic. Everyone wants to get their clicks. Everyone's looking for what is the next new thing that's going to, like, move us to disclosure. Like, everyone wants things now. And this is a long, difficult battle to fight. This is not an easy fight for genuine UFO truth and disclosure is not an easy fight. And I think it's going to take a long time still. And people get impatient. We want results now. We don't want to think that we're fighting against an incredibly sophisticated opponent or adversary that's probably smarter than we are. I'm talking about government intelligence groups, to say nothing of the ETs themselves. They also have their own secrecy protocols. So we're dealing with some very formidable opponents if we want UFO truth out there. And I don't know if there's, what's the biggest area of misinformation or disinformation? It comes out periodically. Last summer, the Wall Street Journal put out a couple of articles that were so horrible, so terrible.
Yeah.
And we don't have to go into the details of it, but you wonder, like, who the hell was that designed for? Well, I think that was designed for the members of Congress to dissuade them from moving forward on the UAP Disclosure Act. I will bet that was what it was for, and I think it succeeded. It intimidated anyone who might have been on the fence. So there's always going to be establishment disinformation and misinformation coming out, and it's it doesn't fool those of us who've been studying this for any period of time, but it's enough to intimidate people who are not conversant with the subject that well. So I don't know if I can have a single answer to your question, but it's something that goes on all the time and it won't stop. We have to expect it to continue because this subject is just too disruptive on every level. This is the most disruptive subject I can think of.
You made a lot of really interesting points there, Richard, but I'm going to bring in something I was going to ask you about later, and we touched on it before I hit record, the whole 3i Atlas situation. I've seen people on various platforms of various different genres create content daily, updating us on 3i Atlas. Now, I don't see that there is any content or any substantial information that you could put out daily shows without making things up or being wildly speculative.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that I think in this, and it's just not to my taste, but there's clearly hundreds of thousands of people who like that kind of stuff. But it's going to come out that this object for me is a comet. It's got some anomalous features, but that's because it's only the third ever interstellar comet that's come in. We're trying to, I use the analogy, and I like analogies, people know this, that if you got off a flight, so I landed in Milan last week, and if I get off the flight and I see two huge, grotesque men, massively overweight, riding mopeds, and I decide based on seeing those two men, everyone in Italy is hugely grotesquely overweight and rides mopeds. That's kind of what a lot of folks are doing with the whole 3i Atlas situation. It's the third of these things. We don't know that this is actually quite common for whatever this object is and where it's come from. I've seen a lot of folks break down quite scientifically, even for a layman like me to understand why the object has gathered speed as it's passed the sun. It's not heading towards the Earth. It's not made any unique moves. It's just the chemical composition of it as to why it changes colour. Yes, there are some anomalies, but that's where science comes in and you study, and then you know for the 4th and 5i Atlas and 6i Atlas and whatever people want to call them. But there's a disappointment for me where even folks involved in the UFO community who are jumping on the sensationalism of 3i Atlas, you're missing an opportunity to rationally pull people into the topic in the right way to say this object is likely prosaic. However, we should be studying it. And that is Avi Loeb's ultimate message, as much as some of that's been lost in media and sensationalism and headlines. You can get people involved and say, what if the next one isn't prosaic? What if the next one turns out to be something interesting? Will we be ready for it? Will we know what to look for? Will we know not to look for? And what we're going to have is in a couple of weeks or months, some of these channels who have been really bad for the clickbait stuff will just move on and people will follow the next story, like you say, that they come up with. And that's actually detrimental to me, to the UFO topic, because what's going to happen for the public, anyone who has an eyebrow raised at this whole 3i Atlas situation, when they find out it's not an alien spacecraft heading for Earth, it's just another example of, is it a UFO? No. And it's detrimental to the topic. And I don't think people either care or realise are doing damage to it, short, medium, and long term.
That's a good point. I think it's an interesting phenomenon, by the way.
Mm,
I think I'm very much on the page with Avi Loeb on this. The way he talks about it strikes me as very rational, very reasonable. He's pointed out there are things about this object that do seem very different, very unusual, and maybe things that you wouldn't necessarily expect from an interstellar object. He's pointed out all of these types of things, which may have good arguments about them, or which may have prosaic explanations, as you pointed out. One example that I believe I heard from Avi Loeb was that it's coming in on our own ecliptic. You have the sun and you have the planet, and nearly all of the planets follow the same basic ecliptic, so the same
mm.
basic level. You don't have them going in all different directions, by and large, and so this thing's coming in. But it seems to me that most astronomical objects might come in on the ecliptic, because I'm going to take a guess, I could be wrong here, that our solar system itself is on the same ecliptic as the galaxy. Milky Way galaxy is kind of a flattened disk, and maybe there's just more debris that's going to be close to our plane on the galaxy. So you might expect an interstellar object coming in on our solar system's ecliptic. I could be totally wrong about our solar system's ecliptic being the same as our galaxies, but I'm just going to take a guess. It's probably similar. Maybe if I'm wrong, someone can tell me in the comments. But
Almost
I guess
a galactic eye level, because you can see it, it's within your field of vision, as opposed to it being up above or looking down below. It's there within a reasonable
yeah,
range.
yeah, essentially yes. So I don't know. There may be other things about this object that also are. They seem strange when you first look at them. They may turn out to be totally prosaic, interesting, but prosaic, and that's fine. I do agree. There's this big part of us. We want the answer to be anomalous. We want it to be alien. Some people really do. I remember back in 2011. So what is that? 14 years ago, there was a comet known as Elenine that was on approach to Earth. Some people watching this will be like, "Oh God, I remember that." And that was a whole big thing that built up for like 6 to 8 months of we had enough social media even back then that people just really kind of went cuckoo about this one. And there were people who were making the claim that Elenine was an alien spaceship and it was an invasion fleet. Like, there were people actually asking me back in 2011, literally, "Richard, should I be worried about Elenine?" And it was the most cringy cultural experience in the UFO community of that year. But every year happens and we have something new. So I don't think we've gone quite as Looney Tunes with Three Eye Atlas as a lot of people did with Elenine. But we're not done yet either. Three Eye Atlas is still on its approach, so we'll see how bad it gets. But look, it's an interesting thing, and I think it should not be dismissed completely as potentially anomalous. I have no shame or embarrassment in saying that. I think it's possible. I would say unlikely, but let's just keep our eyes and minds open and study it, as you say, as it approaches, and see what we can learn.
That's my hope, that it captures the imagination of some folks who go, "Oh, what if this is something interesting?" Maybe it spurs them on to watch Age of Disclosure. Maybe they go and find your books. Maybe they go and find someone's channel. They listen to a podcast. They buy a magazine, and it gets them involved in the topic indirectly. And I think that's something that we should be looking for. Couple of things, Richard, though, just to finish off before listener questions. Eric Davis has just been on a short clip as part of that News Nation interview between Ross Coulthart and James Fox. And James Fox speaks to Eric Davis, who basically says that if the President of the United States would waive all of his NDAs and all his obligations to his security clearances, then he would happily come out in front of Congress or whoever and spill the beans on everything he knows regarding reverse engineering programs, crash retrieval programs, NHI programs, and the like. And I wonder, do you have, if someone said to you, "Richard, put together a 3 or 4 person panel for the next hearing, and we're going to waive all of their NDAs, waive all their security clearances, who are the 3 or 4 people that you would want up there to speak and tell us what they know?
Oh, golly. Well, I would like to see Hal Puthoff be one of those people. I would like to. These are the people that I no. There are undoubtedly there are people in the innermost labyrinth.
Yeah.
And I don't think Hal Puthoff is in that. I could be wrong, but I don't think I think he's closer than most of us will ever get. So I would well, as I said earlier, I would like to see a hearing that features Glenn Gaffney, Robert Bigelow, and Lou Elizondo again, to bring him back, and others, to discuss this whole potential, the story of the failed transfer of what could be Tic Tac UFO technology held by Lockheed Martin, and its failure to end up in the hands of Robert Bigelow's company. I think that's the whole reason OSAP was started, frankly. That's what it looks like to me. But anyway, those people, I would say, I would love to see Hal Puthoff be allowed to waive his NDAs to speak about this in an open way, because there's no question in my mind he knows much, much more than he's been able to acknowledge publicly, even though in the last few years he's gone much farther than he has in the past. Other people, well, I think a lot of the OSAP ATIP crowd. I would say Lakatsky. I would like to see him talking. I would like to see Puthoff, Lakatsky, Bigelow, Glenn Gaffney, for starters. I don't know that they are the best of the best to talk about the depth of the UAP situation, but of the people available right now who seem like they could be practically brought before Congress and the public, those are some names that spring to mind immediately.
Yeah, not
I think
unfair.
they would have a lot to say.
And then one more thing then, Skywatcher is an organisation that I think really kicked off 2025 with the News Nation interview, Jake Barber coming forward, sharing his story in a quite sensational way. We then got the longer interview that was like 2.5 hours, which I think was really important. If people took the time to watch that, it really fleshed out the story rather than the choppy editing of the 45-minute piece, which perhaps moved too quick a pace for a lot of folks to really sink in. And then Skywatcher gets announced as an organisation. They make a big commitment that by the end of the year, essentially they're going to be able to, and I don't want to misquote Jake Barber, but essentially that they would have the technology to bring objects in, either mentally or via technical equipment. And I asked Jake Barber the other week I'm going to stop saying I've been to Sol, folks, but yeah, I asked Jake Barber, and he basically said that they're still on track to deliver. It might not be by the end of the year exactly, but there's no reason with the 10 terabytes of data they're pouring through just now and the peer review process that they can't present something at least tangible and interesting to the public. And I wonder, what's your take on the Skywatcher story, the organisation, and what they're looking to do?
I've not been able to understand exactly what they're trying to do, honestly. And maybe this is my fault. So are they trying to vector in craft with a desire to capture them? Like, at times when I hear this discussed, that is what it seems like to me. And I ask myself, like, how could that be possible? It seems like an absurd proposition. Like, I can't think that when Jake Barber talks about this, he means to say we're going to fake out these craft, lure them in, and then capture them. But sometimes that's almost what it sounds like to me. So I've got to be missing something here. Now, is it that they think they can bring them in, like somehow they have the ability to bring them in? Maybe like Stephen Greer's CE5 protocols. Maybe this seems to be what it's kind of related to. So you can bring them in and coax them into a kind of contact and communication. Is that what they think? That strikes me as nearly as naive as the other outcome. So I have to admit, I'm unsure about how this whole process even makes sense. And then you've got the whole question of the technology that they're using. Before we started recording, we used the phrase dog whistle is kind of like that, but it's really it does make you think of that. Like we've been told that their program has a technological means that is nearly foolproof that can bring these craft in. Well, what is this? So they're working on the patent. They want to get the IP on this. Sure, but can it really exist? And how does it exist? Are aliens, if that's what they are, that easy for us to control? We just blow the whistle and they come and you throw down the net and you gotcha. I don't know if it's that simplistic that they're thinking, probably not, but I have to confess, like I've not really been able to figure out how the system is supposed to work. But I don't think that they've been very forthcoming, to be fair. I don't think that there's been a lot of explanation. So it's really quite vague. I don't know what to make of it. It strikes me as unrealistic, but I'll withhold my judgment because I don't have all the facts.
I think for me, in terms of the dog whistle and how that, I like to kind of war game out in my head a little bit and what would actually be happening. The idea they're signalling, they flick this switch on this box in my head, I imagine, and aliens get a message on their flying saucer to say, "Oh, yep, they're shouting on us down there. Okay, whose turn is it to dive down?" That doesn't make any sense to me. However, if you go into the right area, for example, the woods, and you use one of those duck whistles or whatnot, you can attract the attention of any kind of number of animals with different methods. Perhaps they are summoning something that is more biological in nature, but not human. And there's plenty of them around. They seem to be confident this area is particularly sensitive to these objects. So for me, maybe it is more of a biological organism being summoned and not necessarily a craft of some sort. I don't know. That would just make more sense to me in terms of a technology, because then for me, if Richard, you discovered tomorrow your own dog whistle technology that you could easily manufacture and send to everyone across the planet. If we all flick this on at the same time, are 6 billion of these objects going to show up above each of us? I don't know how that would work.
That's a really good question. I would think probably not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of demonstration that would need to be done by this group and by the tech I think for more of us to consider it a highly credible methodology to do what they say it's going to do. I mean, I'm not trying to throw cold water on it, but I just don't know enough to say one way or the other. It just strikes me as doesn't strike me as necessarily plausible. I would like to learn more.
Yeah, and hopefully we do learn more in the coming weeks. I think we're in for a lot of news happening, which is great for a podcaster, of course, and for yourself on Need to Know. I think there's going to be a lot to discuss over the next kind of 8 to 12 weeks, even into early 2026. Richard, we'll finish up part one there. If you want to grab a break or a drink or anything, we can do. Otherwise, we can carry straight on.
Oh yeah, I'm actually I don't think I need a break. If you want to take a quick break, we can, but I'm ready to go.
No, I'm good. I'd love to get straight into talking about, first off, your new volume of your USOs book. So folks are leaving us at the end of part one. The new episode will be out in a couple of days' time with Richard. Otherwise, if you're on any of the paid platforms, you'll hear this going straight through, and we can just crack on. Richard, so here we are in part two. Time travel and all that stuff. Your USOs book came out now, was it 5-6 months ago, or is my time way off? Yeah.
In I think March, end of February, early March of 2025. So we're in November. So yeah, about 8 months.
You announced at the time and beforehand to me and other folks it was going to be a trilogy, that there's going to be 3 volumes. Is that still the same? You've mentioned part 2 is about to be published. How has that gone? What can you tell us about the second volume of the series, and when can we expect even a third part?
Happy to talk about it. Yeah, the second volume. So all of the cases were written when I published the first volume 8 months ago. So that's close to 700 total cases, and I had to break those into 3 volumes. It was too much content. So I organized the first volume into appropriate chapters with each its own introduction, which gives historical context and kind of extra analysis, I guess you could say. And I've done the same now for the second volume. And then the third volume absolutely will come out. And I expect the third volume to be out in the first half of 2026, and then it'll be done. So the first volume covered from the earliest USO cases up to 1969. And of course, USO is unidentified submerged objects. We're talking water-based UFOs. And what I've tried to do for this study is to try to put together something like a complete history of the phenomenon. Of course, it can never be complete. I have no doubt in my mind that there are multiple orders of magnitude of actual encounters and cases beyond what I've captured, what I've collected. But they don't get reported, or I discarded many cases from the collection just because they were too threadbare. There just wasn't enough to go on, and I didn't want to include them for that reason. But that doesn't mean they didn't happen or they weren't real. There's a lot that was left out, but I've got 700 cases. So the first volume goes up to the end of 1969, and the second volume, which is about to come out, it's being formatted and prepared for publication right now. That covers only 2 decades, only 20 years, the 1970s and the 1980s. That's it. It's like the middle child. It's the one that I wonder if that will get the least amount of attention, because it's just kind of in the middle. And there'll be a lot of people interested in the earliest USO cases, and there'll be a lot of people interested in contemporary ones. Will they be interested in the 1970s and 80s? I hope so, because the fact is that the 1970s, particularly up into the early 80s, was an absolutely insane time of sightings on so many levels. It was the most dense sightings of any decade. The 1970s. I have more USO cases from the 1970s by far than any other decade, even though that's all pre-internet era. Like, you got to ask, like, how would people have reported these cases, and how have they come to us? Well, the 1970s just blows all the other decades away. Now, a lot of those cases were reported online years later to various online websites, but still, I look at that and I think, what was going on in that decade? So that's an interesting question right there. What was it about that time? And then there were other things about the USO phenomenon that became very noticeable during the 70s and 80s. One of the main ones was the fact that sightings at around that time, actually starting in the late 1960s, started going to predominantly nighttime encounters. When I looked at all of the encounters that I collected of USOs up until around 1967, 68, it was almost exactly 50-50 of daytime versus nighttime encounters. In fact, I think it was 51% daytime, 49% nighttime of the cases that I was able to determine, was it, in daytime or nighttime. So, and then it just goes to 3/4 nighttime, almost with the snap of a finger. It's very bizarre, very noticeable. And whereas military cases were even more dominated at night. Since the late 60s, early 70s, military cases are nearly 90% nighttime when they encounter USOs, almost 90%. It's extraordinary. So these are trends that were noticeable really for the first time in the 70s. It's a signal that something has changed in the behavior of these objects. They're adapting to us, is what I think. Also, enormous percentage of electromagnetic interference cases during the 1970s compared with any other decade. And not only the gross number of them, but the percentage of cases that involve EM interference is vastly higher. So there is something very significant happening behind the scenes that, to this day, I think we still don't really have a full explanation for. But these are questions that I do explore in the book. And they kind of led me into questions of, like, who are these beings? Like, what are they really all about? Why do they act the way that they do? It led me into trying a kind of behavioral analysis of these beings through the behavior of their craft as reported in these encounters. And I do think I've come to some provisional conclusions about that. So that's an interesting thing. And then just the cases themselves are, every single one of the cases in this second volume. I mean, you could almost make like so you could make a movie out of many of them, like a full-length feature movie about many of these cases. And you could, about a lot of the other ones, you could make a pretty good half-hour, storyboarding of it that would be full of drama and intrigue as much as any good entertainment that you'd find on television or on the web. Like, these are amazing stories. They're fascinating. Sometimes they're disturbing. Sometimes they're riveting. Sometimes they're mysterious. It's a part of our history that I think all of us, even those of us who've studied the UFO subject for a long time, I don't think we know most of these stories. They kind of slip by us. So I was really excited in collecting them, and then in analyzing them, which I've tried to analyze every single one of them, and in retelling them in a way that I felt that they needed to be retold, in the way they deserved to be told. I wanted to be a good analyst, but I also wanted to be a good storyteller. These are cases that deserve to be told well, and I hope I have done that. As with the first volume, I have a great illustrator. That's Alan Levine, who did a number of really great illustrations of these cases. They will go in the book just as volume 1 did, and as volume 3 will. And I'm excited about it. I think it's I might like it more than the first volume. I don't know. Each of these little books is like a little baby to me, and I love them all. But this is a good one. I believe that people will really enjoy reading it. I really believe that.
Well, obviously, when it comes out, I want to get you on to discuss the book, promote the book, share more stories when I've actually managed to read it myself. But I just want to ask one more thing on the book. Is there any kind of pattern or number of times where entities or beings are seen along with USOs, just given the nature that it involves water, underwater? Do you find it's less involving entities and just more objects and craft, or what happens there?
I have statistics on this that I gathered for the 3 volumes. So I'll just speak for that. Roughly 5% of all the USO cases that I have involve either, I think it's a little more than 5%, either involve the sighting of a being or an alleged being, let's say, or missing time. And there's a little bit of overlap between those, but actually not a lot. So the cases where there's missing time, which I think are very significant, usually do not include the memory of a being. It's just, I lost an hour, I lost 2 hours, that type of thing, and I don't know what happened. When there are sightings of beings, frequently, not always, a lot of these sightings are of beings that look human. They look as every bit as human as you and me. But there are cases where people will claim to have seen a craft maybe emerge from the water or descend low directly over the water, where at times you could see silhouettes through windows, if that's what they are, of beings that did not look human. So there's a couple of those. By and large, I have to say, like, it's they're not overwhelmed with stories of little gray aliens. These beings in the USO encounters. One from the 1970s, in fact, was described by one of the few abductees who actually remembered what the beings looked like in the USO cases. A South American concert pianist player, actually, a very highly distinguished woman. She described them as rat-like. Her name was Luli Oswald, and it took place in the 1970s. Is it true? Well, I mean, she's a legitimate, serious, highly accomplished individual who had went through hypnotic regression and had an incredible encounter visually with a USO, with another individual in a car. They had missing time, and she remembered these supposedly rat-like beings that took her on board. And they were not nice. They were not friendly. What did she actually remember? Who really, when you deal with abductions and you deal with encounters with these beings, I try to remind myself I think there's a lot of cognitive manipulation going on when people encounter these beings. It certainly seems like they have, first of all, if they have an ability to communicate with people telepathically, which is what is so frequently alleged by witnesses, happens all the time when they have these encounters. You almost always hear the idea, the comment that I heard them in my mind. I can't even count how many times I've come across that. So if they could do that, maybe they can manipulate our minds as well. And so I sometimes don't really know what to make of the physical descriptions that people will offer when they talk about an abduction. Like I'm not inclined to disbelieve them. I'm inclined to believe them, but we should keep in mind the fact that there might be some kind of manipulation going on, just so that maybe they don't want you to see them as they are, or who knows. I definitely believe, in looking at the behaviors of these craft in general, my conclusion at the current time, is that these beings have little to no interest in communicating with us, and that they are definitely interested in monitoring and tracking us. They definitely have had to adapt to our growing technological capabilities, which are quite substantial over the last century. I mean, if you really, it's only a couple of generations. So they've had to adapt to a human species that, once upon a time we did not have submarines, and then we did. And we did not have sonar, and then we did. And we did not have aircraft carriers that could go across the ocean powered by nuclear energy. Now we do. Nuclear submarines that could stay under the water basically forever. Now we do. Deep submersibles that can capture more and more of the ocean environment. Now we do. We're getting more and more involved in all of these things. Our capabilities are expanding all the time. And my realization is that any intelligence that's down in the waters, and I'm convinced they are down there, they're not static any more than we are. They may be at a very, very advanced technological and scientific level. I'm sure they are, but they still have to adapt to our changing abilities. And I do think that that's something that's important to them. I think that actually helps to explain in part why they switched to more predominantly nighttime sightings after the late 60s. That was in the late 60s that our satellite capabilities became way more advanced. And, we only got the first satellite in Earth orbit in the late 50s. So it's not like the Earth was blanketed with satellite tech. But by the late 60s, we were starting to turn a corner and have very, very excellent coverage. And maybe that's an explanation. So they've had to adapt to us. And I'm not sure how I got here. Oh, you were asking about sightings of beings and the like. I think that they are not interested in talking to us in most contexts. I mean, maybe on a limited basis, there can be limited communication. But it would almost be like us trying to talk to a human ancestor from 1 million years ago. Those people were smart. They were discovering how to control fire, and they were the smartest animals on the planet even at that time. But could we really have a conversation with them about many things? No, we really wouldn't be able to. What could we explain to them that wouldn't almost destroy them psychologically and in their development? And I've come to suspect that these entities, I mean, you think about how they can probably perceive space and time very differently than we do. They might be able to think much faster than we can think. We have language, which is a powerful tool for us, and it would allow us to run circles around our human ancestors who might have had proto-language, but might not have had the sophisticated ability to deal with ideas and concepts and causality in the way that we can, because we have this amazing tool called language. But what if these other, and that language allows us to think faster and to think more deeply on a lot of matters, because we have conceptual tools that allow us. So if you encounter a being that's got, like, say, a brain that's maybe 20% larger, where it counts in ours or more, or computer enhanced, they could probably think faster. They could probably go deeper than us. They probably have an understanding of space and time and causality in ways that we just can't really comprehend. You really have to ask, like, what could they talk to us about that would be practical for them or us? It might not be that easy. They might not have an easy way to communicate with us. And I suspect, because when I look at the behaviors of these craft and how they interact with us, whether it's military or not military, they especially with the military ones, like, they will come up to the military vessel, they will shadow it for a while, they will move in closer, and then just when they are closest, they seem to be able to disable our ability to track them. So radar goes off, weapon systems go offline, all kinds of other communication systems will often go offline. It's as if they engage in a policy of data denial of us, which I think is what they are doing. I think it is a policy. So they allow us to see them up to a certain point, but not beyond that, and not to record them beyond a certain point. I think that they have a lot of control over that. And but they don't want to talk to us. They just want to track us. That's what it seems to me to be. That doesn't mean that they have a hands-off attitude with our society. There's all kinds of possibilities that are involved with that, including, let's just put this out on the table, some level of infiltration or coordination or management. It's not impossible. It's not like it's definitely happening, but if you were them looking at humanity, this volatile but fragile civilization that we've built, you might be interested in getting it on the inside and guiding it in a way that you think it should be guided. Why would that be impossible? I'm not saying they do that, but I'm going to put it out there. But as far as what we can observe, they seem to be mostly hands-off in their attitude and in their behaviors to us, except for the occasional abduction, and maybe they're doing hybridization and things like that. But they're not having an open back and forth communication with us. That's for sure, because all of this is on their terms, not our terms. They do what they want. They blanket this world. There are sightings around the world every single day, over the oceans, over land, everywhere. And yes, I'm sure many of these sightings that people think are UFOs are prosaic, but not all of them. There's just too many, and there's too many good ones. They're not all just prosaic. I don't believe that. So I think, from my perspective, they are everywhere. This is a dense phenomenon. You asked earlier, what do I think is, you kind of asked this, what is like missing from our conversation, or where are we being misdirected? I'll tell you one thing that's missing from our conversation is the daily quantity of good sightings of objects, whether over land or over water, every single day. This is something that hasn't gone away, it doesn't stop, and it's global. So to me, the story there is, we're dealing with an infrastructure of theirs that is probably very substantial and would be expensive for us to try to replicate, requires maybe a certain amount of their money or their equivalent to money, whatever that is, and definitely their time and energy and attention. I think that is definitely, it's something that's important to them. They are here and they are doing things that they feel are important, and they're not talking to us about it. Like, these are fundamental takeaways that we're really not discussing nearly enough, in not just in the general society, but even in our own community. We're really not trying to look at their motivations, their behaviors, and we're really not trying to ask ourselves, what could this behavior mean? So that's something that I think is important, and I do try to do from from time to time, because we've got to be asking these questions, even if it's speculation, which it is. It's inevitably going to be somewhat speculative, but that doesn't mean it isn't important. We need to start asking realistically of what are the, based on their behaviors, what are the potential scenarios that this involves, you know? And I think, to me, the most logical answer to that is that we, as a planet and as a human species, both separately, for their own reasons, have in a way that I still do not understand, been able to get the attention of other intelligences from somewhere else, not native to this world. And they are able to find us. They're able to see just how unique and amazing Earth is, and how interesting humanity has become. And we have become interesting. You know, we're more like them than we're different, even though I'm sure they're at a different level in many ways, but we're more like them. We use mathematics, we use symbolic language, we deal with concepts and philosophy. We do all of those things, and I am sure they have done and continue to do those things. We have consciousness as an awareness of ourselves, as conscious, independent entities of our own. We're self-aware. So are they. Like all of these things. So I think they're interested in us now that we have, we're going on this kind of quasi-exponential path of technology ourselves. We're developing not just nuclear weapons, but now we are on the cusp of very strong artificial intelligence, which is another leap in our species' ability to engage in data management of all kinds of information. That's power. Management of data is power. And we are becoming powerful. I know there's people out there who want to dismiss us as we're like ants compared to other intelligence. I don't think that's accurate, and I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it's smart either. I think that we're actually very interesting. And, how long will it be before we end up having the ability to discover, let's say, space-time metric engineering in a way that maybe they can do? I think they can. How else are they going to get here from wherever they are? And this is the thing. Skeptics about UFOs are great at one thing. They're great at ignoring all the UFO evidence that we have. There's some amazingly powerful cases that really beg an explanation, and they beg a scientific explanation. Because if there are objects that can do non-inertial instant acceleration, zigzag, stop on a dime, take off like a bullet, all of that, they're using physics that we don't understand. That physics might very well incorporate an ability to bend space and time in a way that allows them to travel through the stars, across the stars. Why not? How they can find us is another question. The universe is big. It's not like Star Trek where you can just, fire up the engines and go. I think it's a lot more complex than that. But I think they figured something out. And we're very interesting to them. I think why wouldn't we be? Why wouldn't Earth be very interesting? Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of life, if you take the grand scale of the universe, but we have an amazing planet. We really do. We have water, we have land. We've been in the Goldilocks zone for quite a while. We have an incredible diversity of life and unique genetic permutations. That in itself would be interesting to any intelligence that can check this world out. But then there's humans. With our little opposable thumbs and our ability to manipulate the environment, and our ability to reason is becoming better. At least we're using tools that allow us to reason better with computers and AI. So I think they're interested in us. I think something was triggered over the last century or even a little bit more that, I sometimes imagine, did they have like a little sentry, an automated sentry that is observing us for a certain period of time that would send off a signal to them to say, okay, now the humans have reached this threshold.
Yeah.
Isaac Newton came along and he's got the three laws of motions, and they're like, okay, they're coming along. It won't be long before they get an Einstein. It won't be long before they get computers. I'll bet you that we're following a very predictable trajectory. I'll bet they know our trajectory better than we do. So they came here, and I think they're watching the show because it's a hell of a show to watch. George Carlin talked about this, in his last years. It's like, well, I didn't vote for these people, but I've got the popcorn. I got a front row seat watching it all happen. It's entertaining, if nothing else, but it's a bit of drama. I think South Park once described Earth as a reality show. Yeah, and that sounds about right. Like we're a great reality show if someone wants to watch us, but we also there's a lot on this world that is probably of great value intrinsically.
I think Rick and Morty had that episode as well, where the giant heads come to Earth and shows what you got, and it's like Earth's it's a galactic talent show, and it's Earth's turn you have to entertain them, and if you don't, they just blow up your planet. So, yeah, that was pretty fun. Have you got time to fire through some listener questions still, Richard?
Yeah.
Because we've not got to any of them yet. I've deleted a few as you've touched on various different things. When can people actually get a hold of your second volume? Do you know yet a rough time?
Well, as soon as we're done talking, I'm going to go back to it. I'm cleaning it up. As I say, the writing's done. I definitely want it out before Christmas. I would like to sell some copies before Christmas. That would be nice. So, you and I are speaking in the first week of November. Hopefully in a few weeks. It's hard
Awesome.
because look, I'm the writer, and I'm the proofreader, and I'm the publisher, and I'm the desktop publisher. Like I'm doing the whole thing, and every step requires certain different things that I have to do. So I'm not anticipating a major holdup. So I think it should be out. I'm just going to say before Christmas.
Excellent. So listen, so much interest, Richard, when you come on the show from different people. I met someone in Milan the other week who's a big fan of yours. They were hoping to see you at the Sol Symposium. Obviously, you weren't in attendance.
Not this time, no.
But I said to Halil, if he could send me in a question, I would happily ask it, and I'm going to do that now. He wants to know whether you have any knowledge of UFO sightings in the Chinese Empire. He says, we know that officials from that time had to keep accurate records of what was happening in their provinces.
Yeah, some. Earlier this year, I decided to do my own dive into the history of Chinese ufology. But you're talking about the ancient Chinese Empire, and there, some of those are collected in the volume by Chris Aubeck and Jacques Vallée, of course, Wonders in the Sky. When you look at ancient UFO sightings that are worth recording, a lot of them come from China and from Japan also, as well as from Europe. Reason being, as you were kind of indicating, China was one of the few fully literate societies back then that would have been able to record wonders in the sky. So there's a few. There's actually some of the best ancient UFO sightings, in my opinion, are Chinese, not European. I think they have some better quality ones. But having said that, I mean, there are some ancient sightings that are interesting, and maybe you could even say good. I'm a little more interesting, a little more up on the more recent era of China from the 1960s and 70s onward. Like what we now know is that even during the darkest depths of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, there were some really interesting Chinese UFO sightings that the military encountered, that civilians encountered. And we started to learn about those after Mao died and Deng Xiaoping became leader of the Chinese Communist Party and instituted some reforms and a certain level of openness. And it led to an explosion of Chinese ufology in the 1970s and 80s and culminated in the rise of the Falun Gong in the 1990s, which was very, very brutally crushed in 1999. China's history of UFO encounters is a really interesting one. It's one that we don't know nearly enough about in the West, but this is one of Earth's major civilizations and one of the most ancient civilizations of all that is very different from the rest of the world in terms of language, first of all, right? So there's always the difficulty of communication. In terms of geography, China historically has always been very cut off from the rest of the world. You've got this immense, you got the Himalayan plateau, you've got the fact that China faces the Pacific Ocean, and to reach Europe, you've got the massive Eurasian continent in between and a lot of desert. So it's always been very difficult to get communication between Western society and China. And to this day, there's still a lot of lack of understanding. So it's a really huge topic. And there's no question that the ancient Chinese Empire did record unusual sightings. What's less clear is what they, were interpreting them as being. Societies in the ancient world, particularly when you're getting into kings and nobility, really always wanted to interpret sightings in the sky as portents. Often that would support their political situation, whatever that happened to be. These were always interpreted as signs from the gods in one way or another. And so they, it wasn't like they had the equivalent of MUFON out there in early times asking witnesses, how large was the object if you held it at arm's length? They weren't doing that. There wasn't really a scientific evaluation of these things. But China in recent decades is an extremely interesting case study of ufology. And we could talk about that sometime. That's an interesting thing.
Absolutely. I just had Samuel Chong on the podcast about 8 weeks ago. He was discussing the book, The Theobao Prophecies, which goes off on a tangent I wasn't quite expecting, slightly outside my comfort zone in a good way, around Jesus and Christ being two different entities, one NHI being involved, all that kind of stuff, and how the book in China's gained a lot of popularity. And it was an interesting conversation. Samuel's a lawyer based out in California. Obviously, he's been in the US for many decades now, but really interesting chap. And if you get a chance to catch that, I think that might be something you would enjoy exploring.
That's interesting. China has a large percentage of people in the culture who are really into the subject. It got strongly repressed at the end of the 90s. The Falun Gong, just for people who may not know, is like a spiritual type of movement that involves qigong and physical exercise as a way to kind of integrate mind and body and soul and spirit. It's a serious discipline. It's an amazing discipline. So Falun Gong arose in the late 80s, early 90s with a definite take on extraterrestrials and UFOs. That actually was an integral part of their philosophy, believe it or not. So you've got this, this is the era of supposed like openness, post-Mao. And so a lot of Chinese people really got into the Falun Gong. It actually became bigger than the Chinese Communist Party and was a threat to the party. But I'm mentioning it here because in Chinese ufology, within the Falun Gong and beyond, you've got this schism. You see it everywhere between the nuts and bolts materialist scientific school of ufology and then the contactee side of ufology and the side of ufology that is interested in things like prophecy and metaphysical matters. And what's surprising is how incredibly popular that latter part actually became, and I'm sure still is within China, but they just have to be very much on the down low about it. So there's a really strong draw, I think, among the Chinese people, at least it seems to me, to these types of metaphysical interpretations of ufology. I think it's got the potential to surprise us all, but it's really not allowed to be expressed very much. So, in fact, it's really not allowed almost at all to be expressed since 1999. So that's an interesting aspect of it. So I'm not really surprised that there would be this interest in ancient prophecies and things like that. But I don't really know much else about it, so I don't know what else to say. But yeah, it sounds interesting.
Long Knife asks, what is Richard's current thinking on black triangles seen over US bases and test areas? Folks like Roderick Castle, who was on with UAP Gerber and Ross Coulthart, talked about this, and Dylan Borland, of course, as well, talked about seeing something similar.
Yeah, it's the triangles have always been a fascinating part of this mystery. We started seeing a lot of triangular craft in terms of sightings during the 1970s. Doesn't mean that they were not seen earlier. There were sightings of triangular UFOs occasionally reported earlier. The question is, who's making these things? So when you think of a triangle, we're often inclined to think, well, we're probably making it. UAP Gerb has talked really a lot about triangular craft, and in fact, the late I've spoken to him myself, Edgar Fouché, who had a lot to say about the TR3 and B and how these are technologies that we have developed. I think that's probably true. Like, I think that we're building at least some of these triangles, but I don't believe we're building all of these triangles. I don't believe we're building them all. There's just too many. And but like, for example, there's a major phenomenon that has been going on for years and decades of people waking up in the middle of the night. I can't sleep. It's 2:00 in the morning. They go outside. They look outside and they see a black triangle hovering over their neighbor's house, for example. Go to the National UFO Reporting Center. You'll come across these types of sightings, or the MUFON database. They get them from time to time. This is a real thing. This is one subset of the larger phenomenon. And what are those triangles doing? Well, I suspect they're over a residential area 200 feet above someone's house in the dead of night. Well, what do you think they're doing? I think they're probably interested in those people inside that house. Maybe they're doing an abduction. Maybe they're doing a visitation of some sort. So it seems like, is that human? I don't know. It doesn't strike me as human. To have for this to be a black project in which you've got your operators going around the world, hanging out over neighborhoods at 2 and 3 in the morning, dead silent, undetected every time. That's a heck of a thing to think. So I think that you've got triangles that we've been working on, and you've got triangles that are not ours.
How much do you think the US government, for example, and the people who know about this topic, know about the abduction phenomenon in particular, in terms of who's doing it, why it's happening, and even if they can predict a pattern of when they could happen, or even bring it upon themselves?
That's a great question. And the information that's come to us through any kind of channel is very minimal on this. If you remember the Wilson Davis notes, Eric Davis was talking with Admiral Thomas Wilson back in 2002 about this. And Wilson, at the end of the transcript there, toward the end, he says to Davis, well, I was told that the abduction part, that's not really even happening. That was not true. And when I came across that, I thought, well, is that actually what they believe, or is that what this guy was telling Wilson? Because I don't think it's not happening, but that is supposedly what Wilson was told. So it's entirely possible that genuine knowledge of abductions may be quite limited. Dan Sherman just did a great interview with Jesse Michael on Jesse's channel. And, one of the things that Dan Sherman did, and I've been a believer in Dan Sherman's accounts for quite a while. Dan Sherman, his story basically is he was trained through the U.S. Air Force to become what's called an intuitive communicator, working with NSA to be able to receive messages from what appeared to be alien beings, to write down coordinates, and to write it down in such a way that he came to believe that he was actually collecting information from them on abductions, maybe among other things. So if that's true, then someone knows about this stuff. And but these things are very compartmented, and they're very, very deeply stovepiped. So who really knows what? This is the grand question. We're talking about a very complex labyrinth of secrecy. It's frustrating. Skeptics will say, well, that's a convenient excuse. You can say there's so much secrecy. And that's why you don't have information. But this is the truth. This is a profound subject. We're dealing with non-human intelligences, clearly that are vastly more intelligent than we are, more capable, that deal with us on their terms. And it's not difficult to see why this would be the subject of tremendous secrecy from a national security point of view. Like all of that's not difficult to see. And that's what we're dealing with. You know, we have this illusion, even those of us who are very skeptical of mainstream narratives, like you, like me, like probably every listener here. But I think we really overestimate the ability of our society to get at the truth. We still have this pretense that we got something of a democratic type of global system here when we certainly don't. It's a very, very, very severely controlled system that's fighting elements that want to break that control, but is still doing a really good job at maintaining that control over narratives of all types, including this one. So it's tough. You know, it's tough to figure out, like, how much do these government officials really know? Or what does what does Donald Trump know about alien abductions, like officially speaking? It's a great question. Will we ever really find out? What did Joe Biden know when he was president, if anything? What did Barack Obama know? We don't really have good answers to these questions. We've got a couple of stories that have come to us here and there. Bill Clinton has his story that he tried to find out and couldn't. I heard this from a few different sources. I'm sure it's true. So if the U.S. president can't get all the details that he, or in the future maybe she, will want, how do you even know who's running this? This is a thing we really don't know. Presidents of the United States are powerful, but I think we can all realize they have their limits of power as well. There's only certain things that they're really able to do, and then they have to be in front of the cameras. They got to shake hands with the dignitaries, do all of that stuff. And then how many of the special access programs, of the hundreds that undoubtedly are there, or thousands, who knows, how many of those are they going to be briefed on in detail and know about and be able to do anything about? Like, there's only so many hours in a day. And we have a habit. We've had a couple of really old presidents in the last many number of years. Like, you have to wonder, Trump looks like he's got a lot of energy, but still, like, you really got to ask yourself, how much are they going to be briefed on this? Can they really do? So, like, you really are wondering, like, who actually is running this? Is it something like SIAC, or is it another private entity that has connections with the U.S. government, or some kind of corporate public-private combination? Or is it all money? Is it all the Bilderberg people? Or, like, this is where we really we fall down. We don't have enough information on this. We get little tidbits. There's much, much more we need to learn.
A couple of listeners got in touch, including Gray. I know you've sent in a lot of questions, Gray, but I'm going to just summarise this one just for time for Richard. But a lot of folks have this idea the abduction phenomenon has finished or stalled or slowed down. And I wonder, if I think about that, is that because there was a time where abductions were more rife, and for whatever reason, the reason for those has finished, and if it's data collection, for example, they've got the data they need, and that's why they've slowed or stopped? Would that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's not impossible. I wonder about this because we're not hearing nearly as much about abductions as we used to. That seems to be true. But then you have to ask, is that simply because abduction researchers are not doing enough work? I mean, back, a few decades ago, we had Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs and John Mack. They were the big three, and they were publishing lots of good books on abduction that were being read by a lot of people. We have another generation of abduction researchers. For many years, we had Barbara Lamb. Barbara is still around. I don't know if she's doing active work anymore. We have Yvonne Smith, who's got some books out. There's Kathleen Martin. There's other people doing work on abduction research. And I do get the sense that there are still abductions happening in our century. But it's true, like, they're not getting as much attention. And I'm not hearing about as many of them. Maybe it is. Maybe it could be slowing down. It's not impossible. But I think, before I make that call, I really think we need to be doing better research on this. Just because we're not hearing enough about them, it's easy for kind of vague statements to get out there that don't really have a lot of data behind them, but they're anecdotally sounded. They seem anecdotally plausible. And then we just say, yeah, no one's talking about abduction, so they must not be happening. Like, I don't know that I would want to make that conclusion. But my sense is that there's actually not as much systematic work being done on abductions, maybe, as there had been in prior decades. Maybe that's as simple as that. I'd be hard pressed to think that they're not happening, but they're not getting as much attention. That's true.
Like, I look at, there was obviously a time where smoking was considered a good thing for you and prescribed by doctors, obviously. And then for decades, there was a lot of research into smoking being bad for you. I would say that research probably still goes on, but not to the same scale, because we're very much of the opinion, yes, smoking was not good for you. Something similar akin to that, where abductions perhaps still happen, but to a lesser extent.
Well, let me add this one thing. I spoke earlier in my USO research about the 1970s being a very active decade. And there were a lot of abduction cases from the 1970s. I mean, Travis Walton's maybe one of the most famous of all is 1975, but there were many, many, many others. It was an incredibly active time of abductions, as were the 80s. But it could be that something specific happened to that time period. For example, it could be that a new group arrived in the 1970s. I often wonder that because there are enough behavioral changes, at least in the USO cases that I've studied during this period of time, to make me think, like, is there something, what is different here starting in the late 60s, early 70s? What has caused this behavioral change? Could it be a response to our growing technological prowess? I'm sure some of it that could be, but the quantity of sightings in the 70s shot way up, and not just with the USOs, but UFOs in general. So could it be that there was a new group, a new operation that came in, and part of what they did, could that have been abductions? Could that be the arrival of the actual black-eyed gray aliens? Maybe they're recent additions to the scenario, and maybe this is what they're doing. And it could be that their program had a certain time frame attached to it. So what I would like to find out is really get into more contemporary abduction research. And it's really hard to know, like, who's really at the leading edge of doing abduction research. There's a bunch of recent there's books, but you know what I'm asking is, like, is there anything that's really trying to be any more systematic about it? And I'm not aware. Maybe I'm missing that.
Can I just ask you to expand on that as a final thing? Do you think the idea then that perhaps something came along in the 70s is that it replaced what was here already? For example, the way we have the space station, and every couple of months or 6 months, a new set of astronauts go on, that others return home and they carry on the work? Or would you think it was a whole separate entity or species that turned up alongside whatever else was here?
I'm not sure what I think, but I imagine it could be the latter of those two scenarios, that something entirely new may have come along. It seems to me that if you can get a visitation from one, you could possibly get a visitation from more than one just as easily, because, from our perspective, interstellar or any kind of travel through the stars seems so difficult that it seems impossible. And by our technology and science, it basically is impossible. We don't really have a way to figure this out. But if there is a way to somehow bend space and time in some way that we don't quite grasp, or even more out there, using by means of an interaction of consciousness itself to the very fabric of reality, It's not impossible in my view. There could be, to use a basic word here, there could be a loophole involved in their ability to come here easily that we just are not getting. We're not able to understand. So if one can do that, then I would imagine more than one might be able to do that. And maybe that's what's happening. The thing is, there's just so many directions we could go with this. You know, you have to ask yourself, like, how long would a typical advanced civilization even last? This is the other thing. So it's not just the distance problem that makes this such a difficult subject, but it's the time factor. Our universe is, roughly about 14 billion years old, and that's a long period of time. So how long does could an actual civilization last? Even if it's as long as 1 million years, that's just like a little sliver. It's like a little thin line compared with the actual age of the universe. So you would think any civilization could have risen and fallen, and would they even overlap with each other? Like, it's a fair question to ask, and I don't know what the answer to that would be. My assumption, though, is that the quality of the history of UFO sightings that we have had are strong enough to tell me that someone's figured this out and they're able to come here and visit us. This is what I think. And that there's got to be a way that they've done this. Are they coming from outside of time? Are they coming, or have they figured out a way to be so stable that they can last for more than millions of years? I don't know. I don't really know the answer to this. This is a difficult subject. I started diving into UFOs 30 plus years ago because I couldn't figure out why our military was taking them so seriously in the 1940s and 50s due to declassified documents that I was able to find. I found out that this was a subject that was being taken seriously. Okay, so that's important. So then I asked myself, did they determine that they were Soviet? Well, it doesn't look like they did. Did they determine that they were ours? And to my feeling is no, they have not determined them to be ours. And there's a lot of good reasons why they're not just ours, if you look at the whole history of this. So that's just, you start running out of options, and you start looking at non-human intelligence, and you start wondering, could they be from elsewhere in the universe? And it's we don't have all the answers. But I tend to think they're from another part of the universe. They exist in space and time, at least some of the time. They've figured things out that we have not figured out. They're ahead of us on the curve of the exponential curve of data control and data manipulation. So they know things that we just don't know. And that might be simple to them and might be impossible for us to understand. So, we have this idea that, well, we can figure it all out, but I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if we really can. But that doesn't mean the problem goes away. That doesn't mean that it's not legitimate. I think it's totally legitimate, but we just may be struggling for a while at a genuine, deep understanding of what it all represents. I think the last thing I'll say here, because I don't want us to sound like, oh, well, we'll never understand anything. There's a lot of things that we know. I can say there's someone here. They're intelligent. They have a program. They have a plan. They don't want to communicate overly much with us. And I think they find us interesting. And I think we can say that. And whether their motivations are to help us or to harm us or to watch us indifferently as everything goes to hell, those are speculative questions, and each one of them has their own perspective, their own way of looking at it, and they could all be true to some extent, especially if you have more than one group that's here. Maybe they don't all have the same agendas.
I think why people like myself and so many others respect you, Richard, and enjoy speaking to you, enjoy listening to you, enjoy you on Need to Know, your own channel, is because you can say, I don't know. And I think less and less that's a feature that gets lost in this conversation. There's so many folks that are happy to tell you what they definitely know and what is definitely fact and why everything else you think is wrong. I think in this conversation, the ability to say, I don't know, is lost on a lot of folks. So yeah, very much appreciate that.
It's good to be comfortable with some uncertainty. You need that. Once we start feeling like we have to answer all the questions, we have to get all the answers, I don't think that's going to happen. Just imagine if it was 1 million years ago and you were part of the species we now call Homo erectus. Well, those are very smart people, but they had limits. And could you imagine talking to someone of that species and their attitude is, I need to know everything about your society. And you'd be like, well, it's never going to happen. You're never going to get it. You're just not going to be able to understand many of the things that we know because you don't have the cognitive capability to do it. That's the reality. And I think it might be similar with us. We tend to think, well, we can figure all of these things out. And we're figuring a lot out. And we're now using tools like artificial intelligence, which may develop a kind of reasoning capability. Maybe AI will become conscious in a way that we might understand conscious. I don't think that's impossible. So there are things that are down the road that we might be able to be assisted by, but for us to think that we're going to be able to figure all of these things out, I think we've been infected by the idea of progress over many centuries, which it's understandable why we developed this idea. We discovered science. We discovered that science is very powerful. We discovered that science can give us many answers that eluded us in the past. Yes, all of that is true. But we also, I think, may have made a premature jump to this idea that man or humanity can somehow be perfectible, that we can just keep improving and improving and improving, like Star Trek, which I look on as basically fantasy. And I love the old Star Trek show, don't get me wrong, but it's basically fantasy. And in that type of a vision of the future, those people, they've kind of figured things out. Yeah, there's still mysteries, there's still some conflict, but we've all learned to play nice in the sandbox, and we've solved our social problems, and we've learned so much, and we're just going to keep going and going. It's a really optimistic view of us. That it's great to be optimistic, but for us to think that our civilization can just kind of keep going infinitely and progressing and getting better all this time and more knowledgeable, more wise, I've got my doubts about that. So for our ability to understand the full import of this topic that we're all discussing here, UFOs or UAP, aliens, there's always going to be things I think that we just may not be able to understand fully. That may be possible.
I agree. Good place to leave it, Richard. And do you want to just once again remind folks how they can follow you, follow your work, and obviously get a copy of USOs Volume 2 when it comes out? We'll
be out. We'll have a YouTube channel called Richard Dolan Intelligent Disclosure. You can just go check that out. I put out videos every couple of weeks. I'm not as active a YouTuber as others, but I do what I can. I have a website called richarddolanmembers.com. There's paywall stuff there, and there's free stuff there. There's a lot that people can go check out to see what I'm up to. I will post just like interesting research that I'm up to. I just recently did a video on creating a taxonomy and a map of what constitutes ufology itself. I may do that as a public YouTube video, because I think it would be interesting to ask ourselves what constitutes ufology today. So I do things like that. I just put them up there for the members of my site. I'll write articles on different aspects of the UFO and world situation. Sometimes I go beyond UFOs. So that's richarddolanmembers.com and my YouTube channel. I've got a Twitter X account, and there's even Instagram. I don't manage those, but I have people who put things up for me, and they do a good job.
Awesome. Richard, once again, thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking to you when that new book comes out.
It was a pleasure, as always, Andy. Thank you for having me here, and a greeting to all of the members of your channel.
That's all for this episode of That UFO Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. If you enjoyed the show, please follow, subscribe, and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcast. It really helps others find the show. If you're watching on YouTube, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. You can also support the show directly and get early access, ad-free episodes, and bonus content on Patreon, or by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube memberships. All the links are over at thatufopodcast.com or in the show description below, along with merchandise and more. Don't forget you can also pick up a copy of my book, Atlas of Unidentified Flying Objects, available now in all good bookstores and through online retailers, including Amazon. Big thank you again to all of you for listening and tuning in. Until next time, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.